Hiya, my name is Molly Balding and I am the editor of the Middle East and North Africa Forum journal, MANARA, and we are here today with one of the writers from the new issue. I was just wondering if you could introduce yourself, your role, and explain a little bit about yourself.
Yes, well, thank you so much, Molly. My name is Alexia Onbargi, and I am a student of development studies at the University of Oxford. I'm on a 2-year program, so it's a very interdisciplinary degree focusing on economics for development, history and politics of the global south, several key ideas and themes of development. But prior to this, I used to work as a communications volunteer in Lebanon at an NGO called Muassasat Amal Association. And also I used to work at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, where I did some research on multidimensional inequality in the Arab region.
Brilliant, thank you. So I was wondering if you could just briefly explain what your article was about for anyone who hasn't had a chance to read it yet.
Absolutely. So my article is called "The Syrian Refugee Crisis, a Humanitarian Emergency or Developmental Failure." Basically, the article argues that, 9 years after the war in Syria broke out, are we still right to call this situation a humanitarian emergency? Or are we seeing a situation of problems in refugee settlements and in refugee populations that have more to do with developmental failures? So, for example, instances of rising child marriage rates, for example, or children that are unable to go to school and are forced to be begging on the streets, or people that have little access to the labor market, or lack of access to sanitized facilities and good housing units. These, to me, sound more like developmental failures as opposed to humanitarian emergencies. And we see these kind of problems in other developing countries as well. And again, they're problems of underdevelopment as opposed to emergencies. So that's the case that I make in the article.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of pick up on that because you mentioned several times in the article the importance of semantics when sort of discussing events like these, and you draw a really clear distinction between crisis and emergency, and I was wondering if you could just elaborate further why that's such an important distinction to make.
Absolutely. So words matter because the words that we use to describe the world around us not only shape the way we understand the world, but they also shape our responses to them, right? And so a crisis is something that sort of happens suddenly, could happen suddenly, but then it's sort of prolonged. And it's a situation that causes a lot of anxiety and fear and suffering. But it can last for a very long time. For example, the climate crisis that we're currently going through has been going on for several years now. An emergency, on the other hand, is characterized by how sudden it is and how immediate it is, and requires an urgent and immediate response in order to mitigate the effects of that sudden disastrous outcome. So it's quite different, because I do think that we have a situation of a crisis. The Syrian refugee situation is a crisis, certainly, but I just don't know if continuing to call it an emergency is appropriate at this point in time.
Absolutely, yeah. You give quite a concise sort of history of the issues in the region, which is obviously really useful in terms of sort of exploring that context. Looking forward, what do you think the sort of most important lessons are that we, both as an international community and as sort of individual thinkers, need to learn from the discourse around the Syrian refugee situation?
So I think what's very important here is to realize that migration isn't an emergency, because the consequences of migration are here to stay. So the refugee situation has been going on for 9 years. I suspect, sadly, it will continue for many more. And not only that, migration will intensify in the region due to climate change. So now people are fleeing war and violence, but there will come a time when there is more migration related to a scarceness of resources and lack of water, for instance. And that migration isn't go south. It's not going to go into the Saudi Arabian desert or into the sub-Saharan deserts. It's going to go into European territory. And so it's very important to, again, move away from this narrative of a humanitarian emergency to looking at really issues of integration and issues of long-term development, because the long-term effects of migration are there to stay.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's really interesting. Obviously, since your article and since sort of the context that was being written in, obviously the world is now sort of taken over by the coronavirus pandemic. It's obviously had a huge global impact in so many places, so many sectors of life. And I was just wondering, should pandemics and other sort of similar public health crises, which are only set to become more likely as time goes on, should they feature in considerations for solutions to issues such as this situation?
Absolutely. I mean, the kind of conditions in which Syrian refugee uh, in which the Syrian refugee population lives in, and the Palestinian population, by the way, which is often neglected in
Of
discussions
course.
of
Yeah.
migration. You know, there are conditions in which people live in squalor accommodation, in which people live in close contact to each other, in which sanitary facilities are lacking or um, severely wanting. And so these are perfect breeding grounds for new diseases and new viruses to spread. Now, I think we have a sort of a moral imperative to look at the refugee situation per se, because it's a huge humanitarian and developmental problem.
Mm.
But at the same time, if that's not enough to look at it, then we should definitely focus on it due to the problems that could arise from any disease emerging from these places. But similarly, it's also important to realize that, you know, if this coronavirus, even when it hits these refugee populations, the consequences are going to be absolutely devastating. And
Mm.
so we need to look at the Syrian refugee situation again, not just as an isolated humanitarian emergency, but as a wider developmental issue, because it really can provide both the grounds for disease, but also it can bear the brunt of the disease as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time here. Anyone who's interested in reading the article and finding out more can head to our website. The new issue is now live. And for more content, please feel free to follow us online. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.